You don't attack your friends, you attack your foes.
That's the problem. Canada is not the problem.
Canada's future rests on one province, and if Ontario stumbles, the entire country goes with it. From federal tax revenue to power grids, from immigration to innovation, Ontario quietly props up everything. It keeps planes flying, banks stable, pensions funded, and most Canadians have no idea. The scary part? That balance is starting to crack. So what happens when Ontario runs out of money? Why does your hospital, your retirement, your electricity bill depend on one province? And what will collapse first if the engine stops running? Stick with us, and you'll see why losing Ontario's economy wouldn't just cause trouble. It could break the entire system. The invisible threads. That dependency runs not only through dollars, but also through runways and routers. Toronto Pearson International Airport, handling 44.8 million passengers annually, is not just Canada's busiest airport, it is a lifeline. Half of all international cargo entering or leaving Canada passes through it. Yet most Canadians have never even stepped inside it. The threads of Ontario's dominance reach every Canadian home in ways hard to trace until they snap. The Rodriguez family in Halifax discovered this when their daughter received an acceptance letter from the University of Toronto. Her education would be partly funded by Nova Scotia, but her future would be written in Ontario and heavily subsidized by it. Technological, demographic, and cultural trends all bend toward Ontario. Shopify's headquarters in Ottawa quietly influence small business operations nationwide. Their choices around pricing or software tweaks immediately affect thousands of retailers coast to coast. When Ontario sneezes, Canadian innovation catches a cold. With 463,000 net newcomers settling in the province every year, Ontario now acts as the country's demographic buffer. Infrastructure groans under the pressure. Yet when Ontario struggles to absorb that growth, the federal government shifts policy for everyone, from Prince Edward Island to British Columbia. Ontario produces 38% of all Canadian film and television content. It is not just where Canada is made, it is how Canada is shown to the world. And through this lens, a single province sets the cultural tone for the entire federation. As more Canadians uncover these invisible dependencies, the idea of national autonomy begins to feel like a polite illusion, the money machine. Federal transfer payments were supposed to keep Canada balanced. Yet most taxpayers don't realize how lopsided that system has become. When Alberta leaders argue about unfair equalization, they often target Quebec, but the invisible funder is Ontario. David Tremblay, a schoolteacher in Rimouski, has never stepped foot in Toronto, yet his salary is sustained by it. The Big Five Canadian banks, Royal Bank, Toronto Dominion, Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Montreal, and Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce are all headquartered in Toronto. That cluster decides interest rates, mortgage lending standards, and credit availability for the entire country. When they profit, federal revenues soar. When they contract, so does every province's ability to pay its bills. Ontario remains the largest contributor to federal coffers, but gets almost nothing back. During the 2023 through 2024 period, Ontario received just $421 million in equalization payments, while Quebec took in over $14 billion. Few voters realize this dynamic exists. Ottawa's dominance in government employment keeps the local economy stable, with ripple effects through Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec. The concentration of public sector jobs in the National Capital Region creates an economic bubble that shields these areas from recession. But it also centralizes power in a corridor few Canadians have access to. Procurement, policymaking, and public infrastructure. Investment also disproportionately favor Ontario-based firms. Being close to decision makers means better odds of landing contracts funded by taxpayers from every other province. Behind the arithmetic lies something few citizens notice. Ontario isn't simply richer. It is acting as the financial circulatory system for the entire nation. the manufacturing heartland. The Johnson family's story begins at the Ambassador Bridge, where assembly line workers in Windsor meet their counterparts in Detroit. Their livelihoods have been tied together across that span for 3 generations, revealing how Ontario's economy isn't just national, it is continental. Ontario produces 45% of all manufacturing output in Canada. This dominance began with geography and trade, but has been maintained by deep institutional support. It is not just that factories are based there, it is that policies, capital and infrastructure continue to pour in, reinforcing the same outcomes. The Ambassador Bridge alone moves 1/4 of all Canada-United States trade. On any given day, thousands of trucks cross with critical components, finished goods, and raw materials. Any delay, from a customs dispute to a mechanical failure, has national implications. Manufacturing timelines are so tight that a single holdup can disrupt production lines in Saskatchewan or shipping schedules in New Brunswick. 62% of all automotive production happens in Ontario. General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, Honda, and Toyota have major plants clustered across the province. Their decisions ripple through the economy. When Stellantis decides to cancel a shift in Brampton, parts suppliers in Newfoundland reevaluate contracts. It is that interconnected. Smaller towns like Ingersoll and Cambridge feed those plants with specialized parts. These towns survive on narrow margins, meaning any shock to the supply chain could eliminate their biggest employers overnight. Trade deals, labor strikes, or new tariffs carry consequences that go far beyond Ontario's borders. What once appeared as provincial economic strength is now being reevaluated. Because in a tightly integrated system, centralized power does not just build, it binds. Look, we broke down a national system most Canadians never even see. You now know the uncomfortable truth about where the money really flows. If you value that kind of honesty, hit the like and subscribe button. The vulnerability matrix. What once made Ontario powerful is now what could unravel the country. Maria Santos witnessed this firsthand while working grain terminals in Thunder Bay. Cargo ships that had once carried prairie wheat to buyers around the world now sat idle. It wasn't a local problem. It was American tariffs hitting Ontario manufacturers and blocking export routes, severing Canada's economic arteries in real time. Economic fragility appears not just in isolated events, but in chains of interdependent systems. When the United States enacts protectionist trade policies, the consequences cascade, hitting rail lines, ports, lenders, and insurers in ways that no economist can model perfectly. Ontario's central place in that web ensures that a blow aimed at one province weakens the entire federation. With real gross domestic product growth projected to fall to 0.6% in Ontario by 2025 under escalating tariffs, national stability is now at stake. Federal employment insurance payouts and infrastructure funding are tied to Ontario's economic health. When it slows, everything slows. Automotive tariffs alone could remove $18 billion from the national economy. The aerospace sector tells a similar story. Bombardier's regulatory battles turned into chain reactions, halting supplier contracts in Manitoba and delaying logistics in Quebec, problems that began in Ontario's industrial core. Manufacturing jobs in the province directly support 300,000 families, but each job creates 3 or 4 more in logistics, finance, or services. Lose one, and entire communities begin to crack. As the country braced for broader instability, deeper structural problems were surfacing. None more urgent than the housing crisis on Ontario's front porch, the housing time bomb. Kevin and Amanda Park thought that good jobs and modest expectations would be enough to afford a home in Toronto. Instead, their search for housing exposed a national dilemma. The cost of shelter in Canada's financial hub isn't just a local hardship. It is a destabilizing force across the entire economy. With average home prices exceeding $700,000 in the Greater Toronto Area, affordability is a fading dream. The consequences stretch beyond individuals. Financial institutions carry exposure to Toronto mortgages through real estate investment trusts embedded in pension portfolios. Teachers in Saskatchewan, engineers in Alberta, and civil servants in Nova Scotia all feel the impact when the Toronto housing market fluctuates. Migration pressures compound the problem. As young families leave Toronto, smaller provinces struggle to keep up with sudden increases in school enrollment, housing demand, and medical services. Meanwhile, Ontario's tax base erodes, weakening its capacity to fund local infrastructure and services. The national financial system is deeply entangled in Ontario's real estate health. Major Canadian banks hold significant portions of their mortgage portfolios in the Toronto area. A drop in housing values would tighten credit across the country and restrict economic activity far beyond city limits. Immigration compounds stress. As most newcomers settle in Ontario, housing and transit systems are pushed to capacity. Overcrowded hospitals, congested roads, and teacher shortages follow. These feedback loops threaten not just livability, but investor confidence and long-term planning. Beneath the housing headlines, another issue was quietly growing, one with the power to plunge entire regions into darkness: the energy paradox. Ontario's clean energy advantage once seemed unshakable. Yet when rolling blackouts began shutting down parts of Sudbury General Hospital, Jennifer Walsh realized that even modern infrastructure has breaking points. Medical equipment powered down. Patients were relocated. And an energy crisis that few saw coming had become real. Ontario Power Generation draws 58% of its energy from nuclear sources and nearly 1/4 from hydroelectric systems. This mix gives the province one of the cleanest electrical grids on the continent, but it also creates dependencies on aging plants, complex regulations, and systems that require continuous reinvestment. 20 gigawatts of baseload power flows from Ontario into eastern North America, powering smelters in Quebec, factories in Michigan, and office towers in New York. When supply falters, the ripple effects stretch across borders and industries. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in steel, chemicals, and manufacturing rely on uninterrupted energy. Even short disruptions lead to production losses and missed export commitments. Yet maintaining that consistency requires multi-billion-dollar investments in facilities that are now reaching the end of their life cycles. Climate change magnifies risk. Summer heat waves increase demand just as droughts reduce hydroelectric output. Air conditioning systems overload circuits. Meanwhile, cyber threats and weather-driven infrastructure failures loom as existential dangers. Small businesses suffer too. Shops in southern Ontario shut down during peak pricing periods to avoid costs. That lost productivity snowballs through supply chains, delaying deliveries and breaching contracts across the country. As policy leaders debated grid upgrades, another risk was silently accelerating, one that threatened to drain the country's intellectual lifeblood: the brain drain accelerator. In a quiet lab at the University of Toronto, Dr. Priya Patel weighed her options. Her work in artificial intelligence had earned her offers from Stanford, Massachusetts Institute of Technology and global technology companies, but Canadian research funding was shrinking, and the choice was becoming painfully clear. Ontario's universities, especially the University of Toronto, rank among the world's elite. Their research drives breakthroughs in medicine, engineering, and computer science. Innovations developed in Ontario shape healthcare systems in British Columbia, digital policy in Quebec, and agritech in Saskatchewan. Yet those institutions now struggle to compete with better-funded rivals abroad. The Vector Institute in Toronto leads the country in artificial intelligence research, but its global collaborations are now threatened by domestic underinvestment. If talent like Patel leaves, Canada's research future dims. over 1,200 startups rely on Mars Discovery District's support networks. Weakening those networks means fewer companies launching, fewer jobs created, and fewer solutions exported from Canada to the world. Graduate students see the writing on the wall and pack their bags. Every researcher who leaves takes public investment with them. Years of education, housing subsidies, and federal grants vanish into foreign economies. That loss accumulates not just in statistics, but in real-world opportunity costs that other nations eagerly capture. Canada's global reputation in innovation depends heavily on Ontario's academic leadership. If those institutions falter, international students stop coming, international firms look elsewhere, and the cycle of innovation slows. Now, as minds drained from Ontario's labs and lecture halls, the country found itself at a crossroads. Fight for its future, or watch it be recruited away. Follow the money. Every federal dollar spent in Prince Edward Island or Alberta starts its journey in Ontario. Robert Mackenzie, a lobster fisherman from Digby, Nova Scotia, learned this during a frustrating delay in his employment insurance claim. As spring closures halted his income, he discovered that the federal programs keeping him afloat relied on tax revenue from Bay Street, revenue that fluctuated with the fortunes of one province's economy. Ontario is responsible for approximately 40% of all federal tax contributions. Personal income taxes, corporate earnings, and consumption levies flowing out of Ontario outpace every other province by a wide margin. Yet few Canadians realize this fiscal reality, believing national programs are equally funded across all regions. In truth, Ontario received just $421 million in equalization for the fiscal year beginning in 2023, while Quebec received $14 billion. This imbalance reveals an invisible subsidy. Ontario taxpayers are funding the systems other provinces rely on. Meanwhile, Ontario receives less federal spending than it contributes. Infrastructure in Manitoba, healthcare in Prince Edward Island, and insurance in Newfoundland depend on the surplus generated by Ontario's economy. Retirement savings across Canada are also tied to Toronto's markets. Pension funds like the Canada Pension Plan rely on returns from investments in Ontario's financial sector. When those markets falter, the consequences are national. Hospitals in rural Alberta, schools in New Brunswick, and roads in northern Quebec all depend on this economic lifeline. The health of one province has become the balance sheet for an entire country. As this truth gained visibility, a new contradiction emerged, one that revealed how deeply flawed Canada's fiscal system had become: the equalization paradox. The very province that funds the equalization system sometimes becomes a recipient of it. Michel Dubois, a social worker in Trois-Rivières, administers programs funded by Ottawa's transfers that hinge on Ontario's performance. Yet provincial narratives still cast Ontario as a beneficiary rather than a supporter. Ontario qualified for equalization in 2018, again in 2023, and once more for 2024. This happened despite its overwhelming contribution to federal revenue. The paradox stems from a formula that measures fiscal capacity in ways that favor provinces with large hydroelectric sectors while penalizing those with manufacturing economies. For example, Quebec benefits from the formula's exclusion of hydroelectric profits, while Alberta is penalized for oil wealth. Ontario, caught between, carries the weight of funding, both while being portrayed as self-sufficient. Atlantic provinces often use federal funds to expand services and build infrastructure, yet these strategies rarely reduce dependency. Instead of fostering economic resilience, equalization sometimes rewards stagnation, locking regions into cycles of need. Political frustrations run deep. Alberta and Saskatchewan voice grievances loudly, but Ontario, despite paying the most, rarely receives recognition or political capital in return. Its taxpayers support a system that often funds services superior to those available in Ontario itself. As federal costs rise, parliamentary reports warn of unsustainable pressures. With an aging population, climate spending, and new programs emerging, the burden is increasingly tied to one province's future. Beneath legal obligations lies a troubling question. How long can a country survive when its most successful province is punished for being productive? The federal dependency, the idea of relocating the nation's capital, is more than political fantasy. It would unravel the economic structure of an entire region. Catherine Liu, a senior policy advisor in Ottawa, has built a career at Global Affairs Canada. Like thousands of others, her livelihood depends on federal institutions that anchor Ontario's regional economy. The federal government employs hundreds of thousands in Ontario through departments, agencies, and national organizations. This workforce underpins entire communities in Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec, supporting families and local economies that rely almost exclusively on government employment. Proximity gives Ontario businesses advantages in procurement. Generations of contracts, professional networks, and geographic access help local firms win infrastructure bids, technology upgrades, and public service outsourcing. These wins ripple through Ontario's economy in ways other provinces rarely match. Federal institutions, from Parliament to the Supreme Court, represent 1.5 centuries of infrastructure investment. Replicating them elsewhere would be cost-prohibitive and politically risky. Security, logistics, and administrative ecosystems cannot simply be lifted and moved. Eastern Ontario towns, such as Kingston and Cornwall, thrive on government stability. These economies weather private sector downturns by leaning on civil service employment, which provides steady income through periods of volatility. Even across the Ottawa River, Gatineau's economy mirrors this dependency. Restaurants, schools, and real estate markets rely on a workforce rooted in federal payrolls. If those operations left, the economic vacuum would devastate the region. Behind the debates about fairness lies a reality that no government dares say aloud. Ontario's role as host to the federal machine is not just symbolic, it is existential. The transfer trap. Most provinces rely on federal transfers. Only Alberta and British Columbia contribute more than they receive. Yet the engine behind those transfers, the province making it all possible, is Ontario. Susan Thompson, a schoolteacher in Winnipeg, learned this when planning her retirement. Her advisor explained that the Canada Pension Plan's health was tied directly to returns on investments made in Toronto. Federal transfers exceed $100 billion each year. These funds support hospitals, schools, roads, and social programs from coast to coast. They also mask a deeper truth. This redistribution would not function without Ontario's unmatched fiscal capacity. Ontario receives approximately $29 billion in transfers, but gives back far more in federal taxes. The resulting net outflow sustains critical services in places where economic activity falls short of local needs. Even short-term economic downturns in Ontario strain the entire system. Pension plans, like the one Thompson depends on, are invested heavily in Toronto-listed companies. When earnings dip or markets stumble, retirement income security across Canada begins to wobble. Small infrastructure projects, waste systems in the prairies, highway resurfacing in New Brunswick, or school expansions in Yukon all link back to fiscal capacity generated within Ontario. These benefits reach millions who may never understand where their tax-funded lifelines originate. As demographic shifts increase healthcare demand and climate policy demands new infrastructure, the federal budget will face growing pressure. That burden lands first in Ontario, and any erosion of its prosperity threatens the entire national safety net. Behind the forecasts and formulas, actuaries saw the danger. If Ontario falters, the whole transfer system collapses. And with it, the illusion that Canada's provinces stand on equal ground, the unthinkable scenario. If Ontario's economy collapses, Canada would not face a recession. It would face disintegration. Dr. James Harrison, a senior economist with the Parliamentary Budget Office, presented a worst-case simulation to a confidential committee. The results projected cascade failures so severe they left veteran officials silent. His models showed how quickly the loss of Ontario's economic contribution would shatter the Federation's financial stability, its creditworthiness, and its operational continuity. A collapse would immediately create a $100 billion federal deficit. The central government would be forced to choose between funding healthcare transfers, servicing national debt, or continuing infrastructure development. No combination of tax hikes or spending cuts across the remaining provinces could close the gap. Attempting to do so would plunge the rest of Canada into economic chaos. Canada's credit rating would be slashed within days. International lenders would respond by raising interest rates on federal, provincial, and municipal borrowing. Projects from public transit in Vancouver to hospitals in Halifax would stall or cancel entirely, and the cost of refinancing existing debt would climb beyond sustainable levels. Essential services, from food inspection to air traffic control, would face budgetary collapse. These programs depend heavily on general revenues, which overwhelmingly come from Ontario's taxpayers and business activity. Without that base, the government would be paralyzed. The ripple effects would travel further still. Pension funds, insurance portfolios, and bond markets all depend on Toronto-based institutions. Supply chains, shipping routes, and trade relationships designed around Ontario's infrastructure would unravel overnight. The simulation did not just predict a fiscal shortfall. It warned of a total systems failure. As panic set in, officials began searching for what might replace Ontario's role in the Federation. What they found only deepened the crisis of confidence. The replacement impossibility. No province or combination of provinces can realistically replace Ontario's role in keeping Canada functioning. Alberta Premier Sarah Johnson confronted this truth head-on as angry constituents demanded answers about shrinking federal support. She laid it out clearly. Alberta, British Columbia, Quebec, none of them could fill the gap Ontario would leave behind. Alberta has energy. British Columbia offers forestry and tech. Quebec brings aerospace and hydro. Yet none possess Ontario's institutional depth, financial infrastructure, or industrial complexity. Over 150 years, Ontario developed not just scale, but interconnection. Finance in Toronto, governance in Ottawa, manufacturing in the Golden Horseshoe. These systems aren't just large, they're deeply integrated. You cannot recreate Toronto's financial district in Regina. You cannot rebuild the University of Toronto's research ecosystem in Moncton. Even the idea of relocating corporate headquarters to other regions collapses under scrutiny. Many international firms would abandon Canada altogether rather than operate outside Ontario's networked advantages. There are also the geographic realities. Ontario's central location in North America, its proximity to United States markets, and its infrastructure, airports, bridges, rail, are all irreplaceable. These aren't just perks. They are the foundation of Canadian exports and supply chains. Consultants reviewing national scenarios were blunt. Canada was built around Ontario for a reason. Without it, the entire framework collapses. Still, some provinces weren't waiting for a disaster to force their hand. They were already planting seeds of resilience, the push to rebalance. Across Canada, provinces began quietly preparing for a post-Ontario economy, not one where Ontario disappears, but where its dominance no longer endangers national stability. In Nova Scotia, Innovation Minister Sarah Kim launched programs targeting clean tech, ocean sciences, and artificial intelligence. Her goal wasn't to replace Ontario, but to carve out new centers of strength. The same was happening across the map. Saskatchewan invested in agricultural tech. Newfoundland and Labrador doubled down on offshore renewables. British Columbia modernized ports and broadband infrastructure, betting on Pacific trade to reduce dependence on central Canada. Universities pivoted too, designing programs around emerging industries, not legacy sectors. Venture capital started flowing into second-tier cities with lower costs and niche expertise. From Prince George to Charlottetown, regional ecosystems began taking shape. Slowly, they chipped away at the perception that real power only lived in southern Ontario. Ottawa began adjusting its approach. Infrastructure grants prioritized regional diversification. Transfer formulas rewarded growth efforts over dependency. A quiet consensus was forming. If the Federation was going to survive, it couldn't be propped up by one province's prosperity. This shift reached beyond budgets. Constitutional scholars like Elena Rodriguez proposed updated fiscal frameworks, shared resource royalties, modified equalization, and regional autonomy for infrastructure coordination. Her proposals gained traction, not just in think tanks, but among premiers looking for long-term solutions. As regional strengths grew, so did confidence. Companies started testing regional headquarters. National identity evolved into something broader, built not around Ontario's centrality, but a network of provincial contributions. International observers began studying the model, not as a crisis response, but as a roadmap. So what do you think? Can Canada finally break its silent dependence on Ontario? Is the country ready to share the weight, or will old habits keep dragging us back into crisis? We want to hear your take. Should every province pull more of its own weight, or is Ontario's dominance just the price of national unity? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching, and if you made it this far, we truly appreciate your time.